Hi friends, welcome to episode 12 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian for 12 years, I found myself asking the question, where's the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I have hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that the ideas expressed in this podcast are my own, and when appropriate, I cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast is something for you. I do want to welcome everybody back after a lovely Thanksgiving break. If you live in the state of Michigan, you might have enjoyed today especially because we almost hit 60 degrees, which for the first week of December is almost unheard of. For many of us, Thanksgiving is the first breather we get after a very long September and October. And if your district had school on Election Day, like ours, we had professional development, several days off was very much appreciated. Before I dive into today's main topic, I want to follow up with several journeys which arrived in my mailbox after I finished recording the last episode. As a reminder, several weeks ago, I asked fellow school librarians on the AASL discussion forum if they would share with me their journey in becoming school librarians, as I'm convinced school librarians by nature are lifelong learners. Kathy from California said her journey began with a love of the public library as a small child and a notebook her mother kept of all the books she checked out. I wish I had had such a notebook from my childhood. I can readily identify with the proverbial light bulb moment that Kathy described as I had one of myself many years ago. Her work at a public library led her to a private school library, and she's been there for the past 24 years. Morella in Maryland described her journey, which took many turns, but, quote, "It's been a wonderful ride," unquote. Because of the tight job market, her first job after graduating from library school was in grades 7 through 12 in a private school and, quote, "not exactly what I had trained for," unquote. What is curious is Morella didn't think her story was typical of school librarians, and yet, reflecting on all the responses shared in our last episode, school librarians and our journey is one of risks and volunteering and additional school and degrees and taking positions which may have not been ideal and being in the right place at the right time and willing to take those chances. Alicia found herself shelving books at her local library and became a library assistant while completing a degree in Spanish. She moved to San Francisco, and while finishing her library degree, went to a local high school in the hopes of evaluating it for an assignment she needed to complete. And I think all of us can remember those from our own program. Quote, "serendipitously," unquote, the school district needed a librarian at another school. She was at the right place at the right time, and the opportunity is one that Alicia created. I am also intrigued with Alicia's bibliobicicleta, which she and a fellow librarian used, a bicycle with a book cart, which they have used for the past 5 years and ridden around handing out books to anyone they encounter. Finally, I was so relieved that Stu wrote back. In our last episode, I had asked if he would enlighten us with his experience as a, quote, instant teacher, unquote. He said he was one of the handful of retirees who was reflecting on a lifetime of teaching and service, and I'd like to read what he replied. Stu writes, quote, "In the late 1960s, in the city of New York, was desperate for teachers. I and many of my fellow male college graduates in 1968 were equally desperate to avoid a postgraduate experience in Southeast Asia. So we were a natural fit for the Board of Education's program they called something like the, quote, intensive teacher education project, hence instant teacher. A major obstacle for participants was taking too many education or psychology courses, which could disqualify you." He continues, "The training we received was 6 weeks long, 3 hours of methods in the morning and 2 hours of psychology in the afternoon. My student teaching consisted of one 20-minute lesson in front of a hand-picked class of 20 middle school students, literally surrounded by 60 of my fellow teachers-to-be. In the psychology sessions, we got lectures on child development. My comrades and I, assuming we'd be sent to the poorest, roughest, and least achieving schools in the city, really felt we would be better served with pointers on what to do when a student came at you with a chair. And so they released us into the field in the fall of 1968, and 3 days later, the New York City teachers' strike closed the schools until November. Yet we, Stu continues, and the school system survived. As you can imagine, for many of my cohort, the time in the schools was similar to Teach for America, a brief stopover on the way to law school, industry, and so on. Others, like myself, discovered we like the kids and the experience. And though librarianship was never a thought when I began, it is of some note that my first assignment in the Joseph Pulitzer Intermediate School 145 was to the library, where I assisted the librarian in reading the shelves. Stu concludes his email with, quote, "One of the reasons I managed to keep going for half a century, it certainly sounds more impressive that way, was that the job was never static." End quote. No, if there is one consistent theme with all our journeys, it's that our jobs were never static. The job market, our district's budget, the student enrollment has always impacted our positions, and as lifelong learners, we've adjusted. We are flexible. We learn new skills. We switched assignments, switched schools and locations. We've had to be resilient in order to continue doing what we love. And now for today's episode, Our Voldemort, Wikipedia. I feel like Don Quixote battling the windmills, and when my family likes to bug me, one of them will say, "Oh, I'll just check Wikipedia," because apparently on more than one occasion, and with more than one glass of wine, I'll get on my soapbox and I will just rail against the evils of Wikipedia. This past Friday, some poor substitute teacher took a second grade class into the lab, which is in my library. My library is the former gym and has 20-foot ceilings, but the partition for the computer lab is only about 12 feet tall. So I heard this substitute teacher instruct the students to Google their passion project topic, and I practically pounced on the poor man. I had been pulling books for the students sitting in the lab as a pre-search, so they would have a book to check out during their next visit to the library. Research skills using the library databases isn't typically introduced before second semester unless requested by the teacher, especially in the second grade. So I gave a mini lesson, as this was my collection time and I didn't have a class coming until after lunch, and I knew a Google search would have produced Wikipedia results instantly. I redirected the class to the library resource page and how to use World Book Online, Britannica Online, as well as Kid Infobits. I guaranteed them that 100% of their research could be done on any of these sites. In fact, when I've assisted my own children in their research for middle school and then eventually high school assignments, nearly all of their research could be obtained without ever having to leave the respective library resource pages for our school district. I cringe when I overhear teachers tell their students to Google something. I've carefully interjected myself on these occasions when I can, making sure that I'm simply offering a destination which is free of pop-up ads and not openly critiquing a teacher's approach to research. I've even described in a previous episode my PD offerings titled Research Like a Librarian. I've taught this during our delayed start staff meetings, and each time I spend a few minutes disparaging Wikipedia, one teacher even said out loud, "Why don't I know this?" And I respond, "Because I teach your students, I don't typically teach you." I'll admit, I've clicked on Wikipedia when settling a bet with the men in our family who must always be right. I've even surfed Wikipedia while watching episodes of The Crown because my understanding of 20th century British monarchical succession is a little rusty. But using Wikipedia to satisfy a bet or one's own curiosity isn't the issue. when your grades, your career, your credibility is on the line, that is when Wikipedia can be a poor choice as a research source. Years ago, I asked a 5th grade teacher why her students were permitted to use Wikipedia. She responded that she liked the outline provided, and she wanted her students to see the outline, nothing more. Recently, I had a teacher share her passion project teaching materials with us, and the instructions which were sent home explained that students could use Wikipedia as long as their parents were supervising. I had to sit on my hands to keep from interrupting the speaker of this PD session. Not long ago, I was studying a high school library resource page of a district which is about 20 miles away from the one where I am. Alongside the databases such as Britannica and Opposing Viewpoints was the Wikipedia icon and link. Don't we all agree? Don't all librarians agree that crowdsourced information isn't a reliable destination for authentic, accurate, and up-to-date information? Have you seen Wikipedia's disclosure page? Aren't we teaching our students and staff to be discerning users of information? There is no fact checker, and as I will mention, it is very susceptible to vandalism. Crowdsourcing means you get anything and everything, and the expert submissions are posted alongside those of the know-nothings. My quest to better understand why some people believe Wikipedia has a place at the table led me down an internet rabbit hole. I was able to pull all my research from 2018, and the links are available in the show notes. This past September, Amazon donated $1 million to the Wikimedia Foundation to, quote, ensure the long-term stability of Wikimedia Foundation free and crowdsourced projects, most notably Wikipedia, end quote. I had never heard of the Wikimedia Foundation, but then I found an example of the projects they fund, and this foundation made the next story possible. It is also the article which inspired this episode, or at least pushed this up to the front of the queue. It was published on November 16th from Encyclopedia Collector to, quote, Wikipedian-at-Large is a profile of New Zealand's Mike Dickinson. His credentials, including a PhD from Duke, are indisputably distinguished. I have never heard of a Wikipedian-at-Large, and his salary and expenses are covered by a grant from the Wikimedia Foundation. He has spent the past year training volunteers, mostly women, to enhance Wikipedia's entries related to New Zealand. He would offer training workshops at local library branches. He began as a volunteer editor for Wikipedia in his spare time when he wasn't working as a natural history curator for the museum on the North Island. Mike Dickinson said that the, quote, work he did on Wikipedia in his free time had much more impact than what he did at his day job, end quote. I wish I could say I found this article reassuring and convincing me of some legitimacy when it comes to Wikipedia. Sadly, no. This article ends with a quote by Mike Dickinson, quote, I often have experts tell me they read a Wikipedia article that they know something about, and it was full of inaccuracies. He said, quote, I always say, well, did you fix them? And if you didn't fix them, why are you complaining to me? It's like walking outside and complaining that it's raining and not putting up an umbrella. Of course you're wet. End quote. Yet another Wikimedia Foundation project is the 5th annual Art and Feminism Wikipedia EditAthon at New York City's Museum of Modern Art, also known as MOMA, held this past March, with similar projects in museums held around the country. This event seemed harmless enough. Free refreshments and free childcare available. Attendees were asked to RSVP and bring a laptop power cord, and their ideas. Tutorials would be provided throughout the day, as well as sessions given by local experts on women's art and feminism, and even one using Wikipedia in the classroom. I emailed this presenter, but I did not get a response back because I would have loved to have heard what she had to say. Attendees were encouraged to, quote, add citations to an article in your area of expertise, unquote. What expertise? This was an open invitation to the general public on the MOMA website, not a select group of academics or candidates defending their dissertations, just anybody who was interested in volunteering their time and happened to come across this website, as well as the free childcare. I shuddered to think how many people showed up just for the free coffee and pastries and a break from their own kids on Saturday. I am confounded. I'm even less entranced with Wikipedia after reading ALA's 2018 Spotlight on Wikipedia, 4 questions with author, librarian, and Wikipedian Merrilee Proffitt. She said, quote, there has been a real effort to get GLAM, G-L-A-M, galleries, libraries, archives, museums, institutions more engaged, and I think that's helped give people in our profession a little more of a guarantee of the credibility of the project, end quote. Nope. As evidenced in the MOMA event, while the institution may be reputable and representative of research and the culmination of efforts on the part of experts, enticing the general public with free Danish and childcare is no way to guarantee an expert of any caliber whatsoever will show up to edit a Wikipedia entry. Merrilee Proffitt also said, quote, in my career, I've worked in a lot of places where there's a hierarchy and you have to ask permission. With Wikipedia, if there's something that needs to be done and it is clear that it needs to be done, you just do it. And if you do it wrong, someone will come along and fix it. It's freeing, and you can feel good about doing it. Just look at how far the Wikimedia community has taken their vision of making information free and available. It's inspiring to see a volunteer community do so and to be a part of it, end quote. That's supposed to reassure me and give legitimacy to Wikipedia. Feel free to make mistakes because the community will come along and fix it eventually. Remember, this community is largely volunteer, which means those fixes are going to come when people have time and interest. I feel like now is a good time to mention that our president's Wikipedia entry had a bit of a mishap over Thanksgiving break. Let's hope that none of our students were researching Donald Trump on Thanksgiving Day for a school project. For most of Thursday, hackers replaced the headshot of our president with a graphic photo of male genitalia. The efforts to undo the vandals ended in the evening with the, quote, protection levels for Trump's profile to be higher, quoting compromised accounts, unquote. I find it unbelievable that the president's Wikipedia profile wasn't already locked as a standard protocol. And to be fair, according to the article, Hillary Clinton's Wikipedia page was also vandalized to include pornography while she was a candidate in 2016. I did read articles on unresolved disputes between editors of Wikipedia pages, and I learned that teams of editors will assume an almost custodial role over some topics. And I want to conclude this exploration of Wikipedia with their very own FAQ page for schools. See the link in the show notes. The following is a direct quote from the FAQ page. Quote, therefore, articles may or may not be reliable, and readers should always use their own judgment. Students should never use information in Wikipedia, parentheses, or any other online encyclopedia for formal purposes, such as school essays, until they have verified and evaluated the information based on external sources. For this reason, Wikipedia, like any encyclopedia, is a great starting place for research, but not always a great ending place. End quote. And here's where I really object in the strongest of terms. Quote, "It is possible for a given Wikipedia article to be biased, outdated, or factually incorrect." In italics, "This is true of any resource." End italics. One should always double-check the accuracy of important facts regardless of the source. In general, popular Wikipedia articles are more accurate than ones that receive less traffic because they are read more often and therefore any errors are corrected in a more timely fashion. End quote. And just how are our students supposed to know which articles have more traffic and which have little traffic except to view the edit history of each article in Wikipedia? Furthermore, for Wikipedia to say that this is true of any resource is misleading. My students are always encouraged to use World Book Online, Britannica Online, as well as EBSCO and Gale databases. And these are going to be factually correct. These are going to be updated, and they will be free of bias. This next item found on the FAQ page is a little terrifying. Quote, "Wikipedia's content control mechanisms are reactive rather than preventative. Anyone can go to almost any page and change the information to make it false or misleading. Although the majority of edits attempt to improve the encyclopedia, vandalism is frequent." End quote. And the following is already displayed on the disclaimer page, but is worth mentioning right here. Quote, "Wikipedia cannot guarantee the validity of the information on this encyclopedia. Caution is advised when using Wikipedia as a source." And finally, I didn't realize that using Wikipedia was requiring the users to have some luck. Quote, "Wikipedia is not perfect. A reader may have the bad luck of arriving at a page just after it has been vandalized and before it has been repaired. There have been many incidents in the past where vandalism has been discovered still in place months after the fact. At any given time, there is some inaccurate information somewhere in Wikipedia." End quote. I want to thank you for indulging me in this rant. I understand that I am preaching to the choir, but I want you to know that we school librarians are fighting the good fight. It is a noble crusade to steer our students and staff to accurate, authoritative, and current research. Our efforts today will hopefully spare our students of the consequences of citing Wikipedia in some future endeavor, which could be at the very least embarrassing or possibly very costly. I do want to shift gears a little bit before we end today's episode. I was stunned to read December 1st's New York Times article, "A Marine's Reaction to a Children's Book Prompts an Apology from the Publisher." As a former high school history teacher, now elementary library media specialist, I have purchased nearly every book in Capstone Interactive's history adventure for now 2 elementary school libraries. The hardcover copies run $24 apiece, and the investment is a significant one. I've promoted these books and featured them on a separate shelf. These books fly off the shelves, and I've overheard my 4th and 5th graders bragging about which of the titles they've read. The book in question was the Capstone's interactive history adventure, War in Afghanistan, and initially an article had been submitted by a former Marine who fought in the Afghanistan war and had expressed a great deal of concern and dismay when his daughters had read this book, and to think that war was an adventure that one could choose. So Capstone did not just apologize to the Marine and his family and others who had been involved in the Afghanistan war, but it also destroyed its entire existing inventory. It discontinued the title in question and is, quote, "reviewing its entire line of titles," end quote, said publisher Patricia Stockland, quote, "I do wish we could also take them out of circulation," end quote. In my 12 years as school librarian, I have never heard of this set of circumstances. I would appreciate the feedback from fellow librarians. The New York Times online forum had responses from veterans and non-librarians, but I would very much appreciate hearing what you have to say. Here is the original New York Times article written by Marine Zachary Bell was titled, "My Deployment Was Not an Adventure, as a Child's Book Tried to Tell My Daughters." I hope to hear from all of you. Please feel free to email me directly at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. Many thanks today. I will pull together all the responses next Saturday and hope to share back with everyone on Monday, December 10th. I would like to thank you for listening today. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Share this link with other school librarians in your district and your PLN. Consider leaving a ratings on iTunes as it helps school librarians learn about this podcast. I would like to thank Nazar Ryback at hooksounds.com for the music you've heard today. And as always, I invite your feedback and contributions. Email me at schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. The next topic will be a crisis in the collection. I hope you will tune in.